There's a kind of quiet that only happens on a Sunday morning, the kind that makes the world feel soft around the edges, like it's holding its breath for you. That morning, in our Brooklyn apartment, the light poured in through the curtains in golden strips, warm against the kitchen tiles. I stood barefoot near the window, cradling a chipped mug of coffee, still in the oversized sleep shirt Michael loved to steal from me. Our cat, Muffin, was curled up on the sill, tail twitching. From the other room, I could hear Michael's gentle breathing, slow and rhythmic beneath our cotton sheets. For a moment, everything felt exactly right. Unremarkable, but deeply good. Then my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name I never looked forward to seeing: Evelyn Bennett. My mother-in-law didn't call to chat. She called when she wanted something. I stared at her name for a beat longer than I should have, then finally answered with the best politeness I could muster. "Good morning, Evelyn." Her voice was brisk, all sharp edges, and no warmth. "Claire, Monday morning, 10 a.m. You'll need to meet me at the attorney's office on 8th and Main. I've sold the cabin in Vermont. The buyer's already put down a deposit. You just need to sign the paperwork." For a second, I didn't speak. I couldn't. My grip on the coffee mug tightened, and I suddenly realized I hadn't taken a breath. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "You sold what?" "The cabin," she repeated as if we were discussing dry cleaning. "You and Michael never go anymore. It's a waste just sitting there. The couple I found is retired. They'll take better care of it. I've handled everything." I leaned against the counter, suddenly cold all over. The cabin, my grandmother's cabin, the one place that felt like mine in this entire chaotic world, had been handed off like an old sofa. That house in the Vermont woods with the squeaky porch swing and wildflower fields out back was the place where I'd learned to ride a bike, where I'd painted my first mural, where I had said goodbye to the woman who raised me when no one else would. And Evelyn had the audacity to tell me without blinking that she had sold it. "Evelyn," I said more forcefully now, "you don't have the legal right to sell that property. The cabin is in my name. It was left to me by Nana Ruth. That's not yours to sell." She let out a sigh, the kind of long theatrical sigh that told me she was done listening. "Claire, I'm doing what's best for the family. It's time to let go of these things. We'll talk more tomorrow. Just be there at 10. Then she hung up. Just like that. I stood there in silence, the phone still in my hand, my coffee now cold and untouched. I could hear the city waking up outside, the distant honk of a taxi, the rumble of a garbage truck. But inside our little apartment, time seemed to freeze. I walked slowly to the kitchen table and sat down. The chair creaked under me, but I barely noticed. My gaze was fixed on the hardwood floor, on a knot in the wood I'd stared at 100 times before, but never really seen. I felt something crumble inside me. A memory, maybe. A sense of safety. The first thing I saw when I met Michael was how different he was from his mother. Where she was cold and controlling, he was warm, careful, patient. The man who made Sunday pancakes from scratch and sang 80s ballads off-key. The man who had proposed to me on the porch of that very cabin. I had said yes through tears with my feet in the grass and a mason jar of wildflowers in my hand. I remembered thinking, if I have this cabin, this man, I'll be okay. I heard the bedroom door open and Michael's groggy voice call out, "Hey, babe, you okay?" I didn't look up right away. My voice was steadier than I expected when I said, "Your mother just sold the cabin." He padded barefoot into the kitchen, eyebrows furrowed, hair tousled. "She what?" "She called just now. Says the buyers have already paid a deposit. Wants me to sign papers at 10 a.m. tomorrow." His eyes widened. "But she can't. That place is in your name." "I know," I said. But that didn't stop her from trying. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The kitchen, usually filled with music or laughter, or the clatter of cooking, felt like a museum full of memories but empty of comfort. I looked out the window. The city moved on, unaware. Somewhere out there, people were walking dogs, ordering lattes, heading to yoga. And here I was in the middle of a life that had just split in half. Michael leaned on the counter, running a hand through his hair. "We need to go to the cabin," he said quietly. "Today. We need to see if she's already done something." I nodded. Of course we did. But even as we started packing an overnight bag, even as we booked the rental car and left Muffin with a neighbor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something far deeper was unraveling. Because this wasn't just about a house. This was about control, about history, about family lines that had never fully connected, and about the one place in the world where I had once felt truly safe, now suddenly under threat not from strangers, but from within my own family. You never really know when a relationship crosses a line until you're standing on the other side of it looking back, realizing you can't go home again. Evelyn and I had always existed in a kind of cold civility, like neighbors who nod but never wave, like passengers in the same car who refuse to speak. She was the kind of woman who complimented with a caveat: "That dress looks lovely on you." "Claire hides your hips nicely." Or, "You make such a good cup of coffee I almost forget you work from home." It was always like that. Just polite enough to keep the peace. Just cutting enough to leave bruises you couldn't show. But she was Michael's mother, and for years I told myself that was enough of a reason to keep swallowing my discomfort. Until that morning. After her call, I hadn't said much. I didn't need to. Michael could see it in my face. When I told him what she'd done, how casually she'd sold the cabin like it was hers to give away, his mouth opened, then closed again, his eyes searching mine for some way. This could be a misunderstanding. But there wasn't one. "That cabin is yours," he said firmly, like saying it out loud would anchor reality. "She knows that. She was there when your grandmother signed it over. She helped box up her things after the funeral. She knows." His voice was shaking with something I hadn't heard before. Not just anger, but a kind of heartbreak. I realized then that it wasn't just my trust Evelyn had broken. It was his, too. We left Brooklyn before noon. Bags hastily packed leftover coffee in to-go mugs, a cooler in the back seat filled with old snacks and bottled water. The drive to Vermont was long and quiet. Michael's fingers tapped restlessly on the steering wheel. I watched the scenery change from graffiti-splashed concrete to endless rows of maple trees, their leaves already hinting at fall. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. I tried to picture it just as we'd left it the last time, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze, the worn welcome mat that still smelled faintly of cedar, the chipped mug with the hand-painted loon sitting by the sink. That place wasn't fancy, but it was sacred. And I had no idea what we were about to walk into. We pulled up just after 3. The gravel crunched beneath our tires like bones underfoot. The cabin looked exactly the same from the outside: the weathered wood siding, the rocking chair on the porch, the little wooden sign that said Ruth's Place, hanging slightly crooked. Everything looked the same, and yet I felt completely different. Michael unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly, as if expecting something to leap out. But the house was still. Dust motes danced in the sunlight. The air smelled of old pine and lavender, my grandmother's scent still lingering somehow after all these years. We walked through the rooms like strangers revisiting a childhood home. Everything was where we left it. The bookshelf of water-stained novels, the Afghan on the armchair, the record player that only worked when you smacked it gently on the side. And yet there was something else, a presence, a feeling, like someone had been here, not to live but to look. It was Michael who found the papers tucked in the top drawer of my grandmother's writing desk, a stack of real estate brochures, crisp and color-printed. He held them out to me like something fragile. I took one and stared. A glossy photo of our cabin, a description beneath it that read, "Charming lakeside escape ideal for retirees seeking peace and privacy. Recently updated, full of rustic character." At the bottom, the logo for Redfin, a realtor's name, and Evelyn's phone number listed as the contact. I thumbed through the rest printouts from Zillow emails, notes scribbled in the margins with phrases like, "Push for fast, close, and price negotiable for cash buyers." Dates going back 3 months. 3 months. I felt a wave of something hot rise in my throat. It wasn't just that she had crossed a line. It was that she had done it slowly, deliberately, while still smiling at us across Sunday dinner, while still asking if we had any new vacation photos from the cabin. Evelyn had been planning this behind our backs for months. Michael sat down hard on the old wooden bench by the fireplace, the papers fanned out on the coffee table like pieces of a puzzle we never agreed to play. "She was really going to go through with it," he said, his voice hollow. "If you hadn't answered that call, she would have sold it without us knowing." I nodded, but I couldn't speak. I was staring at the photos on the page, at strangers smiling in the living room, where I used to lie on the rug as a girl and listen to my grandmother hum while she knit scarves we never wore. The idea of someone else claiming that space, my memories, my childhood, made my skin crawl. "She listed it as ideal for retirees," I said softly. "She wants to hand it off like it's just some seasonal rental. Like it doesn't belong to someone who bled and cried and laughed in these walls." Michael looked up at me, and for the first time I saw something new in his face. A line had been drawn. Not between him and me, but between him and the mother he'd spent his whole life trying to understand. He stood up slowly, crossed the room, and wrapped his arms around me. We stood there for a long time, not speaking, the afternoon light slipping lower through the windows. I could hear the lake outside, the soft lap of water, the cry of a distant loon. And in that silence we made a silent vow. We weren't letting her take this from us, not without knowing why, not without a fight. The next morning felt heavier than it should have, like the air itself knew we were walking into a storm. The sky was overcast as we pulled into the parking lot of Miller and Westwood Attorneys at Law, a modest brick office building tucked between a coffee shop and a medical supply store in downtown Burlington. The kind of place that didn't look like it could hold anything important, and yet somehow our family was about to fracture inside it. I'd barely slept the night before, and Michael hadn't said much on the drive. We both knew this wasn't going to be a negotiation. This was going to be war in polite clothing. We were led into a small conference room that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and old books. Evelyn was already seated at the far end of the polished table, dressed like she was attending a church fundraiser, navy blazer, pearl earrings, not a single silver hair out of place. Beside her sat an older couple in their 60s, the buyers, I presumed. The man gave me a gentle, uncertain nod, the kind reserved for funeral homes or tense family dinners. The woman didn't smile. She just stared, impatient and tight-lipped, her French manicure tapping rhythmically on a leather folder. Evelyn didn't acknowledge us as we entered. Her eyes skimmed over Michael, then settled on me with the faintest flicker of expectation, like she was daring me to break the civility. Before anyone spoke, a door opened behind us, and the notary stepped in, a balding man with tired eyes and a calm demeanor that suggested this was just another Tuesday for him. He greeted everyone, shuffled some papers, then glanced at me. "Claire Bennett." I nodded, my heart thudding. "You're here to finalize the sale of the Vermont property." I inhaled slowly. "Actually," I said, my voice calm but clear, "I'm here because I was told I needed to sign something that I have absolutely no intention of signing." The room shifted almost imperceptibly. The woman buyer raised her eyebrows. The man adjusted his tie. The notary blinked once, then turned to Evelyn. "Mrs. Bennett, can you confirm your authority over the property?" Evelyn's lips thinned into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's a family matter," she said, waving a hand. "We've already discussed it. It's in everyone's best interest to move forward." "No," I interrupted, stepping closer to the table. "We haven't discussed anything. This cabin was left to me by my grandmother. It's in my name. And I don't understand how we've even made it this far without someone verifying that." There was a beat of silence before the notary frowned, reaching into his file. "I'll need to see the title deed," he said. Evelyn froze. For the first time that morning, something flickered across her face. Not surprise, but calculation. She pulled a folder from her purse and slid it across the table, her hand stiff. The notary opened it, skimmed the first page, then stopped. His eyes moved back and forth over the document. He looked up. "This isn't valid," he said flatly. "It's a copy of a deed, yes, but it's outdated. It shows Ruth Halpern as the owner, not Claire Bennett. And there's no transfer record, no signature from the executor, no verification from the county clerk. This isn't enough to authorize a sale. Evelyn's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She turned toward the buyers with a strained smile. There must be a mix-up, she offered too quickly. I was assured the paperwork was in order. The buyers weren't buying it. The woman's hand stopped tapping. The man looked at her and said in a low voice, "I think we need to step outside. If there's a dispute over ownership," the notary continued, his voice more firm, "now we cannot proceed, and I would advise against presenting falsified documents again. That crosses into criminal territory." Evelyn stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is absurd," she snapped. "Claire, you're being unreasonable. You don't even use the cabin. It's falling apart. You're clinging to it out of nostalgia. Selling it is the right thing for everyone." I stared at her, really stared, and felt something crack inside me. Not just anger, not just hurt. Something older, deeper. The grief of realizing someone you tried so hard to forgive never really saw you at all. "It's not your decision," I said. And it never was. She stared back at me face tight with disbelief, as if she truly didn't understand why I wasn't cooperating with her plan. But behind that disbelief, I saw something else. Fear, regret, panic. And then, without another word, she grabbed her purse, turned on her heel, and walked out of the room. The buyers followed a moment later, murmuring apologies, clearly embarrassed to be involved in something they hadn't signed up for. The notary simply nodded and began packing up his folder, muttering something about family disputes being the worst kind. Michael and I were left alone in the room. He looked at me and shook his head. "What the hell is she doing, Claire?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I didn't know. But I had seen it in her eyes. Something was unraveling, something she didn't want us to see. And whatever it was, it had nothing to do with real estate. We left the office without saying another word, the wind picking up around us as we stepped outside. The sky was still gray. The air was colder than it had been that morning. I slipped my hand into Michael's, and for the first time since all this began, I felt the full weight of the question neither of us had dared ask out loud. What exactly was Evelyn hiding? We didn't plan to follow her. It just happened, like instinct taking over after the ground gives way beneath your feet. Evelyn had stormed out of the attorney's office without a word, but the way she walked, too fast, too deliberate, sent something cold crawling up my spine. Michael and I exchanged a glance, no words needed. We climbed into our car just in time to see her silver Lexus pull out of the lot. She wasn't heading home. She wasn't heading anywhere familiar. We followed her through the quiet streets of Burlington, past the last rows of tidy houses, and into the sprawl of the industrial district, the part of town people forget exists, unless they need storage scrap metal or trouble. The sky hung low gray and bloated, as if it too was holding its breath. Evelyn's car turned into a narrow side road, lined with rusted warehouses and buildings tagged with graffiti, the kind of area where nobody asked questions and nobody looked twice. She parked outside a place called Northland Storage Solutions, a squat concrete structure with cracked windows and a sign that hadn't been updated since the 90s. We pulled up half a block away, our car tucked behind a delivery van. "What the hell is she doing here?" Michael asked, his voice low. More disbelief than anger. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too busy trying to match this version of Evelyn, the woman who served casseroles in crystal dishes, and corrected your grammar mid-sentence, with the one now stepping into what looked like the set of a crime drama. We waited a few minutes before approaching our footsteps, careful on the broken pavement. The side door she'd entered was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was thick with dust and oil, and the dim fluorescent lights flickered like they were afraid of their own glow. We moved quietly, keeping to the shadows, the sound of our breathing suddenly loud in this hollow, forgotten place. Voices drifted toward us from deeper inside, one of them. Evelyn's sharp and brittle, the other was lower, slower, like gravel and glass dragged through smoke. We crouched behind a row of dented metal lockers and peered through a narrow gap. That's when we saw him. A man in a leather jacket, tall and broad-shouldered, with a long scar cutting diagonally across his jawline, like a knife had tried to erase him. Tattoos snaked down his neck, not the artistic kind, but the kind that told you where he'd been and who he'd survived. Gang ink, prison ink. The kind of ink that says, "Don't ask, don't cross, Victor Malone." I didn't know his name yet, but I would never forget his face. Evelyn stood across from him, trying to hold herself together, but I could see it in her posture, the stiffness of fear, the practiced calm that comes from pretending you're not shaking. "I told you I'm working on it," she said. "The sale didn't go through today, but it's only a delay. I'll get you your money." Victor tilted his head, not unlike a dog who smells weakness. "You've been saying that for 3 weeks, Evelyn. You were supposed to hand me 60 grand. Today, I had a buyer, a cash offer. My daughter-in-law, your daughter-in-law didn't sign." He cut in his voice, suddenly sharper. "So now we've got a problem." Evelyn swallowed hard. "Just give me until Friday." He took a slow step toward her. "You think I've been patient? I know where your son lives, Evelyn. I know what time he leaves for work. You keep pushing this and I'm not just collecting from you anymore." My whole body went still. I felt Michael's hand grip my arm tight and shaking. I could barely breathe. "I'm begging you," Evelyn said, her voice cracking, the veneer finally slipping. "Don't go near my son." Victor leaned in close enough that she had to lean back. "Then pay your debt." And just like that, the conversation was over. He turned and disappeared into the back hallway, his boots heavy against the concrete. Evelyn stood there for a moment, rooted to the floor, then pulled out her phone with trembling hands. "It's me," she said into the receiver. "The deal fell through. We need another option. I can't let him hurt Daniel." Hearing Michael's name pulled the floor out from under me. I pressed a hand to my mouth to keep from gasping. The rage that flared in Michael's eyes wasn't just anger, it was betrayal. And suddenly everything clicked into place. This wasn't about a cabin. This wasn't about nostalgia or family tension or even control. This was about desperation. Evelyn had put us all at risk, not because she didn't care, but because she was drowning and trying to bail water with her bare hands. We had been so focused on the surface, on the cabin, the papers, the insult of it all, that we'd missed the current underneath, the one pulling her down. Victor wasn't some abstract threat. He was real, he was close, and he was dangerous. I looked at Michael, and he looked at me. And I knew without either of us saying a word, this wasn't just our story anymore. It was Evelyn's too. Her secret had become our crisis. And whatever came next, we couldn't turn away. We didn't wait long. Evelyn had barely made it out of the warehouse when we stepped out of the shadows. Her eyes met ours and froze like a deer caught mid-sprint. For a second, I saw the woman who used to correct my dinner table posture, composed, proud, guarded, but it cracked in an instant, as if the weight of everything finally caught up to her. "What? What are you doing here?" she stammered. Her voice was thinner than usual, barely covering the tremble underneath. Michael stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "We followed you. We saw everything. We heard everything." There was no rage in his voice, only disbelief, the kind that hurts more than anger ever could. "Who is that man, Mom? What kind of trouble are you in?" Evelyn opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hand went to her throat as if trying to stop something rising there, panic or guilt or both. And then just like that, the fight drained out of her. She sank down onto a concrete ledge, resting her back against the warehouse wall, her hands falling into her lap like dead weight. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she whispered. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying, not yet. "I thought I could fix it on my own." Michael and I stood in silence, the air heavy around us. The industrial district buzzed in the distance, a forklift reversing somewhere, the faint clang of metal. But all I could hear was the quiet collapse of a woman who had spent her whole life trying to hold everything together by herself. I stepped closer, my voice steady. "Tell us the truth, Evelyn. All of it. No more games, no more secrets. Who do you owe, and why?" She nodded slowly. Eyes focused on a spot somewhere far behind us. And then, in that low, hollow voice I barely recognized, she began. It started last year. After I sold the old condo and moved into the retirement complex, I came across this investment group online, Greenhaven Capital. They had this sleek website, testimonials from other retirees, promises of steady returns from eco-friendly real estate projects. It looked legitimate. I thought it could help me stretch the savings a little further, maybe even leave something behind for Michael. Her voice cracked, then a slight break that she didn't try to hide. I put in $35,000 at first, then another 20. They kept showing me charts, updates, even sent me statements that looked real. But when I tried to withdraw, nothing. Emails bounced, phones disconnected. That's when I knew. She paused, inhaled, then looked at us. I panicked. I didn't want you to know how stupid I'd been. I didn't want Michael to worry. And Victor? I asked quietly. She flinched. I borrowed from someone I shouldn't have. At first it was just a short-term bridge loan, he said. But when I couldn't pay it back, it got worse. The interest kept climbing. I started selling jewelry, old furniture, even some stocks. But it wasn't enough. So I thought maybe if I sold the cabin. Her voice broke completely then, and the tears came slow and silent. I didn't want to take it from you, Claire. I swear. I thought I could do it quickly, pay off Victor, and you'd never know. And Michael would be safe. Michael sat down beside her, rubbing his hands together, not looking at her just yet. He was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. You should have come to us. You should have told us from the beginning. Evelyn looked at him like that thought had never truly felt like an option. Mothers don't tell their children when they've failed, she said. At least, not women like me. I was trying to fix it. I thought that's what I was supposed to do. I wanted to scream at her for the lies, for putting Michael in danger, for almost selling a piece of me I wasn't ready to lose. But something about the way she was hunched forward, ashamed and small and suddenly human in a way I had never seen, made it impossible. I didn't forgive her, not yet, but the anger didn't burn quite the same. It had turned to something quieter, something heavier. Pity, maybe? Or sorrow. We sat there in silence, the three of us huddled outside a storage warehouse like some makeshift family therapy session no one signed up for. I stared down at the cracks in the pavement, thinking about Greenhaven Capital, the scam that had taken advantage of people like Evelyn all across the country. I'd read about them before. Sleek branding, carefully staged testimonials. Dozens of retirees had lost everything. It was all too common, all too American. Prey on the lonely, promise security, disappear without a trace. Evelyn was just another name on a long list of victims who never saw it coming. Eventually, Michael stood. He reached a hand out to his mother, and for a moment I didn't think she'd take it, but she did. She let him pull her to her feet, her eyes still wet but steadier now. We're not going to let this ruin everything, he said, but we need to be honest from here on out. No more pretending, no more handling things alone. Evelyn nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I believed she meant it. But as we drove away from that warehouse, the road stretching endlessly ahead, I knew something deeper had shifted. We weren't just trying to save a cabin anymore. We were trying to save each other from our shame, from our silence, from the kinds of secrets that rot a family from the inside out. And even though the tears had dried and the truth had come out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still standing on a cliff, and Victor Malone was the storm on the horizon, waiting for the next crack in the foundation. The house was quieter than it had been in days, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that wraps around your chest and makes it hard to breathe. We were back in Brooklyn, the sun just starting to set, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors as we sat around the kitchen table. Three people who had once shared dinners and holidays, but were now bound by something much darker, a secret with a name, a scar, and a price tag. Evelyn sat at the far end of the table, shoulders hunched, a cup of untouched tea cooling in front of her. Michael paced behind me, the way he did when his mind was working faster than his mouth. I had a notebook open, but there was nothing on the page except a single word I kept writing and rewriting: $60,000. We'd gone over every option and then over them again. Sell the last of Evelyn's jewelry already pawned months ago. Ask the bank for a personal loan not with our mortgage and Evelyn's ruined credit. Dip into our savings. We had enough to cover maybe a third of it, but draining that would mean starting over from zero and still falling short. Every idea ended the same way, a door that looked open until we got close enough to see the lock. Then Michael stopped pacing. He turned to his mom, hesitant but focused. "What about Uncle Ray?" he said. Evelyn blinked like she'd forgotten the name, or maybe like she'd hoped it wouldn't come up. "Raymond? From Arizona? He's always had money," Michael continued, "and he's helped us before. Remember when he wired money for your surgery back in 2015? Evelyn hesitated. "We haven't spoken in years, not since your father passed." Michael shrugged. "Maybe, but I have his number, and he always liked me better anyway." He stepped into the living room and made the call. I watched him through the glass doors, his hand rubbing the back of his neck, his voice low, the way it always was when he needed to ask for something he didn't want to ask for. I turned back to Evelyn, who was staring at the mug in front of her like she was trying to remember how she used to drink tea before it was all tied to guilt. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" I asked, not angry, just exhausted. "We might have had more options if you had." She nodded, but didn't look up. "Because I still thought I could protect him," she said. "And now I'm the reason he's in danger." Before I could respond, Michael walked back in, holding the phone. "He's in," he said, voice steady. "He'll send it tomorrow morning. Full amount. Wire transfer." He didn't even hesitate. Evelyn let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob and covered her face with both hands. I felt the smallest flicker of hope spark in my chest, a lifeline, one thread we could still hold on to. But just as quickly, the weight of what still waited ahead pulled it back down. That night, while Evelyn finally slept in the guest room for the first time in days, Michael and I sat on the couch, the soft hum of the fridge filling the silence between us. "You don't think he'll stop, do you?" I asked. "Victor, even with the money." Michael shook his head slowly. "No. Guys like that, they take the money and then they keep looking for new leverage. Or worse, they decide silence is more valuable than payment." I swallowed hard. "So what do we do?" "We give him the 60,000 and hope he walks away." Michael didn't answer. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not just sleepless, but soul-tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones when you realize your childhood ideas of who people are, of who they'll always be, might have been wrong all along. "I don't know," he said. "But we need to find out more about him. If we don't know what we're up against, we can't protect ourselves." I nodded slowly. "Then we hire someone." The next morning, I made a call to a private investigator I'd worked with once before during a client's divorce case. His name was Tom Rourke, ex-cop, mostly clean reputation, the kind of guy who still kept a paper calendar and drove a beat-up Buick. We met at a corner diner near the Navy Yard. He ordered black coffee and listened while I explained everything. No interruptions, no judgment. Just the slow, methodical scribble of his pen on a legal pad. When I told him Victor's name, his pen stopped. "Victor Malone," he repeated. "Big guy. Scar down the left jaw." I nodded. Tom leaned back in the booth and let out a low whistle. "He's not just your average street muscle. Guy's got a rap sheet that reads like a crime novel. Extortion, aggravated assault, wire fraud." And he flipped through his notes. "He's got a federal warrant out of New Jersey. Been evading arrest for almost a year. FBI's got him on their radar." I stared at him stunned. "So he's being hunted?" "Not actively," Tom said, taking a sip of his coffee. "They've got bigger fish. But if someone were to tip them off in the right place at the right time, they'd come running." My pulse quickened. "You're saying we could get him arrested?" Tom raised an eyebrow. "If you're careful, if you've got proof, and if you're ready to pull the trigger." That night, back at the apartment, we laid it all out on the table, literally. The plan, the risks, the possible fallout. The 60 grand would be wired to a dummy account Ray helped set up just in case Victor tried to flip the deal. Tom would shadow us and alert federal agents once we got Victor into the open, a public space, witnesses, cameras, no room for things to go sideways, and yet every second of it felt like we were walking a tightrope over a pit of knives. I looked at Michael, his hand steady, as he packed the envelope with the fake check. I looked at Evelyn sitting quietly in the corner, her face pale, but resolute. And I realized something I hadn't before. For the first time in this whole nightmare, we were on the same side. Some plans feel like scenes from a movie until you realize you're not watching, you're in it. That afternoon, the world moved too normally for what we were about to do. It was a Tuesday in early fall, the kind of day where parents pushed strollers along the sidewalk, joggers made loops around the park, and vendors sold pretzels from silver carts that steamed in the breeze. No one knew the kind of storm that was about to crack the calm open no one but us, and the man who'd been watching from the shadows for far too long. Victor Malone. Tom had been clear it had to happen in public. No alleys, no back rooms, no chances for him to vanish again. Central Park, North Fountain entrance, cameras on all sides, plenty of witnesses, and it's on federal property, he'd said. I'll be close. The moment the money touches his hand, I call it in. The feds are ready. That was yesterday. Now it was 2:47 p.m., and we were already in position. Evelyn sat on the bench, nearest the path, a large envelope resting quietly on her lap. Her posture was still, but her eyes betrayed everything, scanning every face, every movement waiting for the scarred silhouette she hoped might not come. Michael and I stood a few feet behind, pretending to admire a nearby statue. My heart was hammering so loudly I couldn't hear the pigeons or the soft ripple of the nearby fountain. Everything was filtered through the thump of fear and the whisper of hope. Somewhere nearby, Tom sat on a park bench in a Yankees cap phone in one hand, coffee in the other. He didn't look like a man about to send someone to federal prison. He looked like someone killing time. But that's the thing about people like Tom, they blend until they move. Victor arrived at 2:59. He didn't walk, he stalked. Black boots, dark jeans, leather jacket with creases so sharp they looked like scars themselves. The long, jagged line across his jaw was impossible to miss. He looked at Evelyn first, eyes narrowed, smile cold. Then his gaze drifted and caught mine. I held still, forced my expression into something unreadable. He didn't linger. His eyes moved past me to Michael, to the joggers, the families, the piece he didn't belong to. Then he walked toward Evelyn. "You're late," she said, her voice steady, in a way that made me ache with pride and fear. "You're early," he replied with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Got the money?" Evelyn held up the envelope. 60,000, like we agreed. He took it without hesitation, weighing it with one hand before sliding it into his jacket. But I saw at the moment something shifted in his eyes. He scanned the park again, slower this time. His hand brushed against the inside of his coat the way a man reaches for something not meant for sunlight. A weapon, or just a threat. I wasn't sure which was worse. "You brought your son," he said, glancing back toward us. "And your little housewife." The way he said it was dismissive, but something in his tone had sharpened. "You don't trust me?" Evelyn didn't move. "No," she said softly. "I don't." That was it. That was the moment. Victor's lip curled as he stepped forward too close, hand twitching like a man deciding whether to fight or run, but he didn't get the chance to choose. "FBI. Hands in the air." The voice came like thunder, loud enough to make pigeons scatter and children scream. Within seconds, 4 agents in plain clothes were on him, guns drawn, badges, out voices sharp and layered. Local NYPD officers closed in from both ends of the path, their radios crackling. Victor turned one hand still inside his coat, but it was over before it began. He was slammed to the ground, arms pinned behind his back, curses pouring from his mouth like acid. "You set me up!" he roared, eyes wild. "You think this ends with me? You have no idea who I work for." The agents ignored him. One read him his rights as they cuffed him. Another opened his jacket and pulled out the fake check untouched. They'd never even need it. He'd walked right into the trap, arrogant and certain that fear would always work in his favor. But this time, he'd underestimated the people he thought were weak. I felt my knees nearly give out, the tension in my body finally cracking. Michael reached for my hand, his grip warm and grounding. Evelyn stood frozen, watching the scene in silence. Her face didn't show relief, not yet, just a kind of stillness, as if her body couldn't process safety so soon after danger. One of the FBI agents walked over to us. He was calm, professional. "We've been looking for him for a while," he said. "Federal charges in 3 states. You did the right thing reporting it." I nodded, but I couldn't find the words. None of us could. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice dry. "Is it over?" The agent paused. "For you." "Yes. For him. It's just beginning." They led Victor away in cuffs, still yelling. People in the park whispered, took photos. But none of it mattered. The storm had passed, or at least the eye of it. We sat on the bench for a long time after that. No one said much. A breeze moved through the trees, brushing the leaves in soft applause. I looked at Evelyn, at Michael, at the space between us that had once felt so far, now drawn closer by fire. We hadn't won. Not in the traditional sense. We hadn't gotten back our savings. We hadn't erased the fear. But we had reclaimed something else, the truth. The unity, the stubborn strength that comes when people choose to fight for one another, even when it's hard. Even when it hurts. 1 week later, we returned to the cabin. The air smelled different somehow, not cleaner but older, as if the land itself remembered everything that had happened and was quietly choosing to let it go. The trees were beginning to change their edges, tinged with rust and amber. The gravel crunched beneath the tires the same way it always had. But this time, it didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like coming home. Michael got out first, stretching his arms and breathing in deep, like he always did when we arrived here. And I followed slower, letting the wind brush through my hair, feeling it carry away the last shreds of fear that had clung to me like mist. Evelyn stayed in the car for a while. I didn't rush her. When she finally opened the door and stepped out, she looked around as if seeing it for the first time. The porch swing, the chimney with the missing brick, the old oak tree where I'd carved my initials beside my grandmother's the summer I turned 12. She didn't say anything, but I saw the tears gather in her eyes, and I turned away to give her that moment. Not out of pity, but grace. "She's been living with us since everything happened, just for a while," she says. "She started seeing a financial counselor, joined a local support group for scam victims, even downloaded an app that sends alerts when something smells too good to be true. It's strange to see her like this, softer, smaller, but maybe also more real. There are moments when I still feel the sting of what almost happened, when the memory of her trying to sell this place creeps up on me like a shadow I didn't invite. But then I watch her reading on the porch with a blanket over her knees, or laughing at something Michael says over breakfast, and I remember that forgiveness isn't about pretending it didn't happen. It's about deciding what still matters after it does. I've been filming pieces of this story over the last few days. Just for myself at first. I thought maybe someday I'd share it. Maybe someone else is out there right now sitting at a kitchen table like we did, staring down a crisis that feels too tangled to survive. So this afternoon, I took the camera and walked the perimeter of the cabin just as the sun was starting to set. I talked not to an audience, but to the trees, the wind, the version of myself who had stood in this same spot weeks ago, full of disbelief and dread. My voice was steady, a little quiet, but sure. I talked about the phone call, the papers, the warehouse, the fear. And then I talked about the shift, the turning point, when we stopped surviving separately and started leaning in. When Michael stopped asking why and started asking what now. When Evelyn, for all her mistakes, finally let someone hold the weight she'd carried alone for too long. When I, stubborn, guarded, always needing control, finally let go of the idea that forgiveness had to be earned in order to be real. The last shot I recorded was taken just beyond the tree line, where the golden light poured through the leaves and caught the edge of my face. I looked straight at the lens, the camera catching the small creases at the corners of my eyes, the smudge of dirt on my jeans, the faint smile that had taken me weeks to wear without guilt. And I said, "It wasn't the cottage that saved us. It was the moment we stopped pretending we were fine and chose to fight for each other finally as a family. Then I turned the camera off and walked back toward the house. That night we lit the fire pit behind the cabin. Michael grilled burgers while Evelyn set out corn on the cob and a homemade pie she insisted on baking herself. We ate at the old wooden picnic table under the string lights I'd hung last summer but never taken down. The breeze was cool, the fire warm, and for the first time in a long time, our conversations didn't feel like they were balancing on old fractures. They just flowed easy, uneven real. At one point, Michael looked up from the grill, caught my eye across the table, and gave me a look that didn't need translation. We made it. Not all the way, not perfectly, but far enough. Far enough to breathe again. Far enough to begin. There's a sound that happens when peace settles in, not silence, but something quieter than noise. That's what the cabin sounds like now, and maybe that's all I ever wanted from it. Not escape, not possession, but a place where the worst thing could happen, and love would still find a way to return.